Okay, so these are the items that we're going to be running through in this session, and we'll jump straight in. So the first one under administration is reports that don't need to be seen. What we're referring to here is Statseeker's default behavior of hiding reports that don't apply to the type of hardware that Statseeker is monitoring on your network. Now there's a couple of settings that drive that process. So we're off in the admin tool. I'm going down to network discovery and advanced options. Under advanced options, all the way down the bottom, we've got our reporting section. And the first setting here is report hiding. So this is on by default, and it's just running that script that I just mentioned where it hides reports that don't apply to the types of hardware that Statseeker is currently monitoring on your network. The other setting, admin show all reports, overrides that value for any user with the admin role. Now this is off by default. So what I've got is I've got it turned on this server, and if I look over at my console, I'm on as the admin user. And if I scroll down the report list in the console here, you can see that there's quite a lot of reports. I think there's over 200, there's 220, 230, something like that, on a standard Statseeker version 554 server. You'll get additional reports if you apply custom data type packages to your server, but this is probably just fairly common for a standard install. And we can see that there's a range of reports down the bottom here where we're looking Ubiquity Wireless, Cisco WAN, Riverbed WAN accelerators, Sonic Wall VPN. Now these are all referencing hardware which I'm not currently monitoring on my network here. And I've got another user logged into this same server. This user over here has the all groups permission, so they can access data from every device on the server, the same as the admin user, but they don't have that admin role applied. So if I look at their report list, you can see it's in a much abridged version of the report list that we saw from the admin user. And this is what you'll typically see, but don't think that this is the full extent of the reports available on your Statseeker server. Turn it off for the admin users and have a look and see what we currently cover by default. Anything outside of that you want covered, talk to Statseeker support, and we'll put together a custom data type package for you that will cover any hardware which isn't covered by any of the stock reports you see here. The next item is dashboards with automatic titles. Now I've got my personal copy of the default Statseeker dashboard, the network summary. So I've gone and made a copy of that dashboard so I can edit the settings. Now, the issue we're trying to address here is if you've got users that aren't familiar with the dashboards or aren't familiar with Statseeker, and they're using looking at one of the Statseeker dashboards, or if you send a screenshot or a dashboard snapshot to someone, they might not be aware that the content of the dashboard panels is being driven by the selection of the group variable. So in this case, the group is set to all. We're looking at the network summary for the entire monitored network. But if this was changed, we'd be looking at, say, just a single office in Athens or the AU hardware, something like that. We're only going to be looking at data from a subset of the devices on our network. But there's no indication from any of the panels that this data has been filtered by this selection. So if they're not familiar with it, they might not be across exactly what's being presented. Now, I've made a copy of each of these panels, and I've just dropped them in another row down here. And you can see here that the title of these panels is referencing that selection we've made there. I'll turn off the AU hardware and we'll jump down to Boston. And we can see that the title updates to reflect the data that's being displayed. Now, in order to do that on your own dashboards, if you've got a device or a group or an interface variable, something like that, what you need is the actual variable name, which is contained inside the dashboard settings under variables. And we can see here that the name for this group selection is $group. In order to get my panels to reference that value, open your panel up in edit mode. In the general section where you've got your title, you can just drop in the string for that variable name, and it will update as you use the variable selector. The next item we're looking at is drag within graphical reports, and we'll touch on a little bit on the impact of your reporting period on trend lines. So I've got one over here. So we're looking at inbound and outbound utilization for an interface. over the period of today. Now, you're probably all familiar with the updated reporting engine in Statseeker, which allows you to interact with the data on the report by horizontally dragging and zoom in, say like this down period here. I can zoom in and see when it went down and when it came back up, double click to get back out. But if you're looking at something like a temperature value where you don't get very much variation, it's all kind of packed in fairly tight within maybe a degree or two for the majority of it. If you are looking for a slight change or you're looking for some detailed information, you can always drag vertically as well to be able to zoom in and get stuff, get a view into data that might not be as clear when you're looking back at a default view. The other item being the impact of trend line, reporting period on your trend line. So the trend line is a line of best fit that is applied to the data currently being displayed in the report. If you've got data, something like that, a temperature where there's not much variation, it doesn't really matter so much about the reporting period. You'll get a fairly representative and easy to interpret response from a trend line. When you've got very variable data like this, where we've got pre-business hours for this remote office coming into their start of their working day, and the utilization ramps up very quickly and then will peter off for the rest of it. The trend line only represent what is being displayed in the graph at the time. So you can see from before business to now, a marked increase in both inbound and outbound utilization. It's fairly obvious from the graph. If this was reduced down to something like the previous 4 hours, we'd get a very different trend line. As we're getting in towards the end of the business day, we're seeing a decrease in both of these values. The trend line only represents what's being presented on the graph at the time. So if you've got very variable graph like utilization on this link, where it changes during business hours and outside of business hours, to get an idea of how data is how utilization across this interface is changing over time. The trend line is very good for that, as long as you push that trend line, the reporting period, out to a little bit more. So if we push it out to say 30 days, just give me a sec to that one to come in. We can see that in the previous month, very flat trend line, not really any change. You can see the inbound utilization change, very, very minor decrease, and very, very minor decrease in the outbound utilization change. So trend line is a very good indicator of what kind of changes are happening across this interface over time, which might not be terribly apparent when you're looking at a graph like this without the trend line there to highlight it for you. The next item we're looking at here is cross-origin resource sharing. So this is when you want to make Statseeker's data available to a third-party tool. Now, browsers don't like an agent running on one domain requesting data, non-public data, from another domain, and they'll generally block that. They'll pay attention to the response from that second domain, which will then say no, they don't have permission to pull that data, and you won't be able to communicate with it. So if you want to make Statseeker's data available to a third-party tool, you will need to, in some instances, drop in a cause allowance to allow that third-party tool to request data from the Statseeker server. Now, I've got a tool set up over here, which at the moment is pointing to my training server that we were just looking at there, and I'm going to send a quick request to it. And we can see that we're not getting a happy response back from the Statseeker server. Communication is being denied between those two domains at the moment. So to address that, if you want to get Statseeker data into a third-party tool, in some instances you're going to need to make a cause allowance on the Statseeker side. So I'm going to go back to the admin tool. All the way down the bottom, we're looking at Statseeker administration, our cause configuration. And this is the default cause configuration, a series of exclude and include rules. And at the moment, we're looking at exclude, and it's a regex string, so exclude everything. No domain has permission to go and pull non-public data from the Statseeker server. So what we need to do is make an allowance for that third-party domain. I'll just grab that one and jump back into our configuration. And we need an include rule. drop that one in, so it's regex. I'm going to make this start of the string and escape the slashes and the full stops. We'll make that anything within that domain off to the end of the string. Now, in the same way that the include and exclude rules is rules that we use with the IP address scan ranges, an exclude rule will always trump an include rule, and currently we're excluding everything, so this include rule won't have any effect until we update the exclude rule to something a little bit more specific than all things. I'm just going to delete it and then save that cause configuration. Now the next thing I need to do is actually restart the Statseeker web server in order to have this rule put into place. So again, Statseeker administration, under cause configuration, next one down, services. I'll just jump into edit mode and we've got our web server there, and I'll just restart that one. And there we go, reload that fellow for us. Okay, and back in our cause testing tool, I'll send that same request again off to my training server. And now we get the pre-flight check has come back okay. The third-party service is being able to send a request off to the Statseeker server and got a happy response back. The next item we've got here, the last one for this session, is using forecast data in your alert configuration. So I'm just going to jump into the console for a sec. All of the devices on this Statseeker server are simulated devices. So those devices are just using canned data, reporting that on a loop through the Statseeker servers. There's no real data coming through from these guys. It's all just looped canned data. With one exception, the Statseeker server is actually monitoring itself, and so I'm actually monitoring the data partition on my Statseeker server, and I've got a report for that one here. So this is from when the server was spun up through to the now period, and this is my data partition on my Statseeker server. This is the accumulation of all my time series data from that simulated network. Now, traditionally, if you're setting an alert, you might put a threshold against it. And that threshold would be against the actual data coming in. So if I was looking for this 75% mark that I've got here, utilization for that data partition, I'd set an alert to trigger when my data partition was 75% full. But what we've got here is the forecast data. So what Statseeker's done is it's grabbed the previous 6 months worth of time series data for this data partition, built a data model, and then used that to project behavior out into the future based on the history. And so this is our forecast data of the utilization of that partition. Now, rather than waiting until I actually hit that 75% and then triggering the alert, I can anchor the alert to this forecast data instead, giving me lead time to address the issue before we actually encounter it. Now, to do that, I need to go back to the admin tool. Alerting and event management, off in our threshold configuration. We'll just add a new threshold, and I'll call it my data 75. And we're looking at file systems. So file system and a use percent. That's what we're after. I'd probably go with something like a maximum value. Check it once a day. See if it's above that 75% utilization. And I could filter it down to whatever data partitions I was after. If it was just this one we were looking at there, that would be the training server. Oh, I need to select my file system first. And there's our data partition. So this is the more traditional threshold configuration. Once a day, check the use percent on the data partition on the training server. And if that maximum value is above 75%, create an event and trigger an alert. Now, what we could do is, rather than waiting for us to cross that 75% threshold, is rather than anchoring it to just a normal maximum or average or something like that, I can use a forecast value instead. Now, there's a few different formats in here. I'm going to use forecast value. If you're interested, there's lots of documentation and a video that goes into detail around these different options. For this instance, we're just going to use a value. I'm going to put it 42 days into the future. And that will then, rather than checking it each day and seeing if we've hit that 75% utilization, what I'm going to be doing is, again, still once a day, check the use percent on the data partition on my training server, forecast 42 days into the future, and if that forecast predicted value is above 75%, create the event, and if there's an alert hanging off that event creation, the alert will be triggered, giving me 6 weeks to address the issue before I actually encounter the problem. Okay, that's everything that I wanted to run through in this session. Thanks very much for your time, and I'll catch you guys in the next one.